Now we got mutations and getters. What could be missing? There is another important concept, another important feature Vuex exposes. But in order to understand it, let's go back to our code. Let's say in the increment mutation, we don't want to increment immediately. Instead, we want to wait 2 seconds and then increment. Now, this might be a dumb example, but a better example could be an app where you send an HTTP request and you wait for the response, and only once the response is there, you want to change your state. Put in other words, you sometimes have code which runs asynchronously, which doesn't finish immediately, but sometimes in the future. The problem is that mutations must be synchronous. You're not allowed to have any asynchronous code in there. So if you run a mutation, it needs to execute step by step without any pause and immediately change the state. It's not allowed to do anything that may take a bit longer. The reason for that simply is that if multiple mutations execute, every mutation should get the latest state. And if another mutation was committed but didn't finish yet, that is unexpected and will lead to errors in your program. That's why a key requirement of mutations is that they have to be synchronous. But what if I do want to wait for 2 seconds? We could do this with set timeout. There we could wait 2 seconds, and in the function here, which then executes after 2 seconds, we update our state. But this is actually not allowed. It will work if you try it, but it is a very bad practice and nothing you should do. Instead, Vuex has a better concept in place for working with asynchronous code. Besides mutations and getters, it also has actions. And components should trigger actions, which then in turn commit mutations. Because actions can now use asynchronous code. And because of that, it's actually considered a good practice in general to always put actions between components and mutations, even though components could commit mutations themselves, and that wouldn't be a problem if you only had synchronous code. But even with that fact, that directly committing mutations from inside components often would not be a problem, even with that, it is considered a good practice to always put actions in between to ensure that you never accidentally put asynchronous code into mutations. So how do actions work then? How do we add them to our store? In main.js, besides mutations and getters and state, we can add actions. And I'm doing this here. I'll add actions here. And actions also takes an object, just like getters and mutations did. An action, again, is just a method. For example, increment. You can use the same name here as you do in your mutations. So here I got an increment mutation. I'm also using an increment action. You don't have to use the same name, but often you will, because often you just have an action in between a component and a mutation. So using the same name makes sense. Now this action will get an object as an argument, a context object. And this context object is full of interesting things. The action will get this argument automatically by Vuex, like all these Vuex features do. Now context, for example, has a commit method, which you can call. And it does what you think. It commits a mutation, just like you could commit it from inside a component. You can pass a second argument as a payload, and you can pass an object alternatively to the 2-argument way of using it. But here I only need 1 argument, and that will be the name of the mutation that should be committed. Now we'll have a look at the other things inside of context in a second, but for the moment let's leave it like this. And now we got an action which commits increment. The interesting thing is that actions, unlike mutations, are allowed to run asynchronous code. So we can take our timeout here and wrap context commit with it. With that, the mutation is synchronous again, but the action is asynchronous, which is allowed by Vuex. It simply commits the mutation only once the 2 seconds have passed. And now we need to change our component code and make sure that we don't commit from inside the component, but that we use the action instead. And how do we use an action then? How is that meant to happen in Vuex? Well, inside of the component where we previously committed, we can now dispatch an action. And the cool thing is, the syntax for dispatching is pretty much the same as for committing. You can either dispatch with 2 arguments, where the first argument is the action name, so in my case, increment here, and the second argument is a potential payload you want, or you use the 1 argument syntax. Here, however, I'm dispatching increase, which doesn't exist as an action yet, so I will quickly also add an increase action so that this will work. Simply add a new action named increase and context commit increase here. Your action will receive the payload that was added to the dispatch function, like value here or like this second object, as an extra argument. So here we will automatically get payload, which we then can forward to the committed mutation. So this is how we can set up an action that also has a payload and forwards that payload to the mutation. Of course, you could also change the payload before you commit this mutation. You can do whatever you want to do in this action, whatever needs to be done for your application to work correctly. But let's get back to the components. We dispatch actions just as we committed mutations, with the difference that we now run actions instead of mutations. And therefore, we can also do this in change counter and simply dispatch the increment action here. And with all those changes in place, if we go back, this still works, and only after 2 seconds the add to button click is having an effect. But now we're doing this in the proper way using actions.